Mr. Speaker.
Sir William CO.
I rise to take a call on the Resource Management Amendment Bill and say that Labor opposes this bill at its second reading. This is part of a trend of the government enacting a series of reforms to the Resource Management Act and related legislation. It's a step in that general trend of removing environmental protections from the Act and reducing local decision-making to allow for the centralisation of power. A pattern has emerged from this government, Mr. Speaker. Instead of acknowledging and recognising the value of local government, this government instead views local government as an extension of central government and treats local government as a government department to do the bidding of the national government. The national government sees local government as playing a subservient role to the central government, and they view mayors and councillors really as people that ought to do the bidding of Mr. Key, Mr. Nick Smith, Mr. Joyce and Mr. English. And National continues to fail to recognise that local governments are and ought to be treated as equal partners in the delivery and achieving of quality outcomes for the people who elected local governments and parliamentarians to the positions we hold. And so this bill, in my view, destroys the ability of local communities to make local decisions and to arrive at local solutions, because this government wants to centralise power in their hands, in the hands of Mr. Key, in the hands of Mr. Nick Smith, in the hands of Mr. Joyce, in the hands of Mr. English, and as my colleague says, in the hands of Jerry Brownlee. Why? Because they have an attitude that they think they know best. They think they know better than the collective wisdom of local communities. And this government's focus is clearly about supporting their business mates and not the rest of hard-working New Zealanders. And also because I think they don't understand what it means to have a real and genuine partnership with local governments. Partnership requires trust. And I think National's mentality is that they are born to rule and they think no one else can or should, least of all local representatives and local council. That's the kind of mentality they have. Look at the way they treated Environment Canterbury in that particular region, replacing duly elected councillors with government-appointed commissioners. Firstly, promising elections would be held this year, and then reneging on that promise, and now postponing elections to whenever they feel like it. And despite protests from Canterburyans, this government persists in their holding power. Look at the way they've treated Auckland Council. Firstly, with Mr. Nick Smith pretending he was negotiating in good faith. Then once he was back in Wellington, announcing if Auckland doesn't do as they're told, this government will override Auckland Council and run Auckland from the beehive in Wellington. How's that for arrogance? Those two examples give ample evidence of their complete and utter arrogance when it comes to local government. It is further evidence that National doesn't like local governments. They might from time to time use the word partnership, but they don't believe in it. Partnership isn't based on ultimatums, such as we've seen and heard from Mr. Nick Smith. Do as you're told or we'll override the powers of local governments. That's not partnership. That's not the kind of behaviour. That's the kind of behaviour that we've seen from Mr. Bainimarama in Fiji, or people will liken to that behaviour of Mr. Mugabe of Zimbabwe. It's terrible behaviour, Mr. Speaker, but that's how this government has been treating local governments ever since they came into power in 2008. This bill forms part of several bills that make up phase 2 of a series of government reforms to the RMA, with a substantive change coming later this year. The substantive part of this reform will include the government amending Section 6 and 7 of the Resource Management Act to change its purpose and a raft of other changes. This bill must be considered in the context of that larger reform coming later. The essence of these reforms is the centralisation of power and undermining of the environmental protections in this bill. The consistent theme that I read in this bill is the centralisation of power in central government and the reduction of power by local governments in local decision-making and allowing them to arrive at their own local solutions for matters which we in this side of the House know local communities and their local government authorities are well qualified to make. It needs to be noted that the Resource Management Act is one of the fundamental pieces of legislation to local authorities. In the Productivity Commissioner's report earlier this year, they identified that regulations made under the Resource Management Act are the most significant regulatory responsibilities local authorities have. And yet, the changes we see seem to focus more on economic development than anything else, and there's a big question mark on that, whether the benefits benefit the rest of New Zealand. The changes this bill proposes will affect the role local governments play and will risk imposing significant added costs to local councils and ratepayers. The Labour Party is committed, Mr. Speaker, to improving processes under the Resource Management Act so that unnecessary and vexatious delays in decision-making around consents can be avoided. We don't support any undermining of environmental protection or of the right of communities to be engaged in the consent process. This bill is seen as a power grab by the government, and Labour won't support it because it takes so much power away from local communities. We need a government that works from the grassroots up, not the beehive down. One wonders, sir, what the government has against trees with their overturning an Environment Court decision. While the tree provisions have been improved at Select Committee, they are still unwieldy and will impose unnecessary costs on communities. The changes to Section 32 unpick the balance of the Resource Management Act. It's designed to fit with the government's wider agenda to turn the Resource Management Act into an Economic Development Act rather than an Environment Protection Act. The Section 32 test requires that any proposal be monetised or given some quantitative monetary value as opposed to any intrinsic value of the environment affected by the proposal, which makes it unlikely to work and biases it towards economic development. The decision to allow the ministers to set an investment level by regulation to require councils to refer consents takes power away from local people to protect their communities. And it's also unclear to us what this investment threshold will actually mean in practice. The documents released to the Labour Party under the Official Information Act show that the investment threshold was written in just 2 days after a private secretary for the minister suggested in discussions with officials on the 12th of September last year and went to Cabinet on the 14th. Advice on the risk around the proposal did not come back until after this. So this is poor practice from a government making major changes to the Resource Management Act. Labour supports the fast tracking of the Auckland Plan in principle and the improvements to provisions in the bill, such as Clause 124 at Select Committee, to make it more manageable. It's good, sir, that we see that government putting in place the ability to set regulations to monitor the environment more accurately. However, when the next comprehensive environment report was meant to be completed this year, and the government is only putting the legislation for regulation-making power forward now, it seems to be too little, too late. Labour would be an active, hands-on government that would improve the RMA without undermining environmental protections or shutting out local communities. And as my colleague, the Honourable Marion Street, has said, Labour will repeal any provisions of a new Resource Management Act which undermine environmental protection.
We'll be hands-on.
Eugenie Sage.
Mr. Speaker, pleased to take a call on the second reading of the Resource